Now, I don't know if you can relate to this, but you've gone to a shoot. You have absolutely nailed the composition. The light was perfect. The animal, because this is about wildlife, was close, and really all your stars aligned. And then when you got the shot back, it came back soft. And the purpose of this podcast is to open up a series of 4 where each week, for this week and the next 4 weeks, I'm going to be looking at 5 issues that happen specifically for wildlife, but they obviously apply to other types of photography as well. And I want to look at particular faults, mistakes, errors that we make as photographers that really do ruin those moments. And the reason I want to do this is that in wildlife particularly, and there are other types of photography where this is true as well, but in wildlife, particularly, you often don't get a second chance. So it's really, really frustrating if everything does line up for you and then the shot's not right. And I've experienced that. I'm sure pretty much everybody who photographs wildlife has had that experience as well. So that is the reason for this short series. So I hope you enjoy it. So let's get into it. So the first thing actually I want to make clear before I do get into it is that this isn't about buying additional equipment. So those of you who've listened to me for a while know that I'm only a believer in buying additional gear when you absolutely need it and you are very, very clear on why you need it and what it's going to deliver to you. So I just want to add that caveat before I start. And so like I've said, there'll be 5 mistakes in each of these 4 podcasts. So what I'm going to talk about this time is shutter speed being too slow, having the wrong autofocus mode, because it's important, particularly with wildlife, that you understand how your autofocus is operating and you're using the right mode of autofocus setting. Shooting wide open when you shouldn't. So I'm talking about aperture here. And also, number 4 is underestimating what happens when you're in an environment that's very hot. So you can get all sorts of distortion coming in. That is another factor. And then finally, I'm going to talk about poor stabilisation technique. So they're the 5. I will go into them a little bit deeper. That wasn't it. So here we go. So shutter speed too slow for the subject. Now, I tend to handhold a lot of the time. So I'm hand-holding my camera. It's not always true because sometimes if I'm in a vehicle that's stationary, I might just rest the camera lens. So I'm usually using a long lens, a 100 to 400, or I've just invested in some new gear. So I've now got a 100 to 500. And just to be more comfortable, I'll sometimes rest that on the edge of the vehicle if it's an appropriate vehicle. But if I do that, I always make sure I've got a pad of some sort underneath the lens just to get rid of any vibration that's coming from the vehicle, because typically we'll keep the engine running, particularly if it's large animals, because we might need to get out of there pretty fast. So what do you actually need for wildlife? Well, when I'm hand-holding, I tend to shoot fast. So I'll typically be shooting at 1,000th of a second or even faster. And the reason I like to do that is, first of all, to just freeze the action. So the way I like to shoot generally, not always, but generally, is to just freeze the action. So if it's a whale breaching, for example, everything's frozen. The whale in midair, water droplets everywhere, but everything's frozen. Or if I'm lucky enough to see an animal hunt, a predator hunting, then I want to freeze that action as much as I can. However, it is a personal choice. So you need to just be aware of what result you're trying to get. So you might want something that looks much more dramatic. So if you are photographing, let's say, a cheetah running down some prey, If you shoot at a slightly slower speed, so here I'm talking in the hundredths of a second, maybe below 1/500th of a second. So you're panning with the animal as it's running. You're following the cheetah, and what you get is foreground and background blur, and also maybe some blur on the animal. It depends. Generally, the heads on cheetahs will stay pretty much in the same place relative to the ground, but obviously the rest of the animal is going to be moving. So if you have the opportunity, and that's probably a big ask because it's not often that you get to see cheetahs doing that, and if this is a one-off trip that you're doing, that might not be the best approach. But it's something to think about. If you are shooting with a slower shutter speed, you can get a lot more motion in the image, and that's a completely different photograph to what you get if you are freezing the action. So the first thing about shutter speed, if it is messed up, the chances are that your shutter speed is too slow, because a lot of the time when something's going on, the animals are in motion, we might be in motion. So in the instance of a humpback whale, for example, I'm on a boat that's moving. I'm probably pivoting to get onto the animal because I don't always see where they're coming up. So I need to be ready to shoot. But if you think about it, you've lost the shot. It's that fast, that kind of situation. So I will shoot fast so that I can freeze what's going on and freeze that moment. With land-based animals, especially where I'm stationary, I'll experiment with different shutter speeds to maybe get a bit more motion. But having said that, I don't often get to see an animal chasing down prey, so that's definitely somewhere where I tend to shoot fast, just to make sure I've got a good record of it. And this is important to recognize as well. So the shutter speed that you're going to use for an animal that's stationary, if it's a lion sitting under a bush or having a sleep in the midday sun, is quite different to the shutter speed you're going to shoot. You're going to use if that lion was chasing something. So what it comes down to, so with the shutter speed issue, it's first of all know what your kit, your lens and camera combination needs in order to freeze motion. So get familiar with shutter speeds. And the rule I generally use is that if you want to freeze action, it depends on what you're using, again, what you're shooting with, but you definitely want to be above 1/500th of a second, and you probably want to be in thousandths of a second, depending on what it is you're actually using and the situation. So if you're still on the ground, maybe 1/500th is enough, depending on how fast things are happening. If you are on a boat that's moving, then you definitely want to be at least 1,000th of a second. As you drop below that, so certainly once you start dropping below 1/500th of a second, you are likely to get more and more motion coming into the image, and that will show itself as blur. And it will be at the faster speeds, maybe a foot moving, or maybe a bit of background blur. And as you start to reduce that shutter speed further, getting close to 1/100th of a second, you're going to get more and more blur in there. So completely different subject. When I used to photograph aircraft at air shows, propeller-driven aircraft, I would always shoot at 1/125th of a second and pan with them and try and get my timing right so that the aircraft was sharp. And if I got lucky, I'd even get a nice view of the pilot. But the background and also the propeller were all blurred. So with the propeller, I was aiming for a propeller disc, not just propeller blades that looked like it was, I just hung a model up and was photographing that. So the important thing to remember here is really two things. Is think about what you want as a final result, and then understand what different settings on your camera are going to deliver for you when it comes to shooting things in motion. That's what it comes down to. Do you want to freeze it? Do you want some motion in there? Because they can be really amazing shots, but unless you practice a lot, the chances are you're going to blow it. And if it is one of those one-off events, say a cheetah chasing down an impala or something, that's really hard. If you decide to be a bit creative and it all goes wrong, that can be really, really disappointing. So anyway, that's mistake number one. And with mistake number two, now I think this is a really important one. So it's the wrong autofocus mode for it's for moving subjects, and also where you have a lot of things in the foreground and background. Now, I will say, with newer cameras, with the increasing use of AI, to some extent, this is less of an issue, but you really need to understand how your camera works, because with modern cameras, so I've just got a modern, as in the latest generation, particularly mirrorless cameras. So I've just started using a Canon EOS R6 Mark III, and this you can program to recognize eyes, it can recognize faces, that sort of thing. So with that setting, once the camera's focused on what you're aiming for, then it will keep focus on that as that subject moves closer to you or further away. If you are using probably most DSLRs and older cameras, you probably don't have that capability. So it's then really important to understand, first of all, what you're focusing on. I always use the spot focusing, the smallest focusing area. So it's generally a dot in the center of the screen as my focal point. I tend to use back button focus because that means I can focus on my subject, and with the back button focus, let go of that. And as long as it isn't moving towards me or away from me, I know my focus is good and I can just recompose as I need to. But I think moving to newer cameras, there's probably less need for that. But if you're working with a DSLR, it's a good skill, a good technique to understand. But you do need to understand how your autofocus is working, how it's locking on a subject, and also how the tracking is working. If you're tracking something, if you want the camera to do it for you. So again, the thing there is to practice as often as you can, and if you can, in environments that as near as possible are similar to what you're going to be shooting in. And the thing there with wildlife is you tend to have things in the foreground that you don't want to be focused on. There tend to be things in the background you don't want to be focused on, and your subject might be relatively small in the viewfinder. So again, coming back to our cheetah, cheetahs like to hunt in savanna. So savanna means that you've got a lot of grass, and if you're relatively low down, which you're likely to be in a vehicle, you might be above the grass level, but there's potential for different things to get between you and the subject. This is where you really need to understand what your autofocus is going to lock on, because you don't want it locking on something that's very close to you, and then your cheetah is very blurred in the background, and equally locking on something in the background, which again puts your subject out of focus. So the important thing is to, I think, use the smallest autofocus point you can. I never use zone focusing. I never use blocks of 9 or 16 AF points. So I just keep to that center one, and then I can recompose. So for years now, I've used that and back button focus, and that's worked really well for me on the whole. The thing I like about back button focus is some things can be quite tricky to focus on. So, for example, I was photographing some elephants in Zimbabwe, and they were in the bushes. They were, browsing. And so naturally, I've got lots of staff, and I'm trying to focus on an elephant's eye, which, if you're familiar with elephants' eyes, they're quite small relative to their head. So it's quite a small target I'm trying to focus on. And I've got loads of stuff getting in the way, like twigs and leaves and branches and whatnot. So having got that point, though, I could then shoot away. I could then recompose as I wanted to and shoot. And I'm setting a depth of field to make sure I've got a useful and a usable focus box, is how I think of it. And so that's really important to understand how your autofocus is working. So if you're not very familiar with that, or if you find you're getting a lot of images where the camera's just focused on the wrong thing, then look at how your AF is set up and set it up accordingly, as I've described here. Okay, so that was mistake number 2. Mistake number 3 is shooting wide open when you shouldn't. So this is about depth of field, which is really important. What you need to understand, though, is what stays in focus. It depends on the lens you're using. So telephoto lenses are much more sensitive than, say, a wide angle. So you're probably not going to be using a wide angle lens for wildlife, but you might. I don't know. I don't want to stifle your creativity here. But if you're using telephoto lens, then what's in focus will vary much more depending on the aperture you set. So, for example, you might have an animal. It depends. It also depends how far away you are, which is the other thing as well. I was hesitating because that's the other thing to bear in mind here. If you are shooting an animal, I'm thinking of animal portraits. There's a portrait of a lion actually that's been in one of my collections that I really like. It was shot in South Africa, and I can't remember to be honest, I'd have to check what the aperture was, but it was pretty small. So, pretty large. So the depth of field was quite narrow. It was either around f4 or possibly even lower, maybe 2.8, something like that. So you have to remember, if you're a fair distance from the animal, you can zoom in so it looks nice and close. But it is really important to get a handle on exactly what's in focus and what isn't. So I've caught myself out with this. I remember with crocodiles on. I was in. I can't remember the name of the river in Botswana now, but anyway, there's loads of crocodiles by the edge, and I was focused on the crocodile's eye, and it had its mouth open. It was just gaping to stay cool. And unfortunately, my depth of field, I didn't quite set it right, so the snout was slightly out of focus. So if you don't understand how depth of field works, what you've got to remember is that once you've focused on your focal points, so generally an eye, the area that's in focus between your focal point and yourself, so the eye and where you're standing or sitting or wherever, is going to be less than what's in focus behind the focal point. So in other words, behind the eye in this case, so the back of the head, back if it's an animal that's on the ground like that. So it is important to just get a feel for that, and of course that will vary with distance, what's actually in focus. So again, with these, I think I'm not a fan of chimping, which is where you take a shot and you have a look at it, but it is really important if you're not sure what your depth of field is and you want to make sure you get the shot right, and particularly if the animal's just stationary. I mean, crocodiles, when they're just lying there doing that, tend not to move much unless something really disturbs them. So you do have time to have a quick look and maybe shoot at different apertures, just so that you've got a range of focal zones, areas that are in focus in that depth of field. So generally what I like to do is to use the biggest aperture, as in f4 or f2.8, something like that, if I'm shooting a portrait, because I prefer to keep the front of the face in focus. So, the snout or whatever, and the nose. But what's behind is less important, because what I really want to do is have people look at the eyes of the animal. I might use leading lines or things like that to create a little journey for them to reach the animal's eyes. But that's where the real connection is. And that's where you get some sense of the animal in terms of its personality. Is it aggressive? Is it peaceful? Is it feeling threatened? All of those things. So I always do that. And I like to keep the depth of field as narrow as I can in order to do that. But as I've said, there is a danger if you're not careful and you're not really watching what's going on, that you can keep that area too narrow. Now, in the case of things like humpback whales, which I've spoken about, so if I'm going to be shooting those, I'll set quite a large depth of field zone. I might even just shoot at f22, something like that, so I know pretty much everything is going to be in focus. And the reason, very simply, is that I don't know where the whale's going to come up. And I do shoot with other apertures with a narrower depth of field, but that's only when I've got I've still set myself that sort of focus box in front of me where I know everything will be in focus. and I'm pretty confident that's where the whale is most likely to come up. I've even shot one where a whale came up and then fell backwards. It fell away from me, and as it went backwards, it went out of focus. So there's an aspect of trial and error with this, but of course, with wildlife, they're going to pop up anywhere. So you really need to be able to work on the fly. Okay, so that was mistake number 3. So shooting wide open when you shouldn't. So again, just be aware that if in doubt, give yourself a larger depth of field. So shoot at f5.6, f8, so that you've got more depth of field than if you try and get too precise with the what's in focus and what isn't. Okay, so number 4, if you're paying attention at the beginning, is understanding what the atmosphere is going to contribute. So if you've got heat distortion and distance. So this is something, to be honest, there's not much you can do about it in terms of, I mean, you can shoot at fast shutter speed, that might minimize it, but you're going to get some distortion. But what I would suggest there is, so you're going to get this when you're further away from your subject. So you can try just cropping in, zooming in as much as you can. It may be that you just use the effects of that atmosphere to create something that deliberately isn't sharp, because if you're not going to get a sharp picture, you're not going to get a sharp picture. But what can you do with that situation? So think a little bit more outside the box. And those kind of images can be quite atmospheric, even though the animal you're photographing, which is probably some distance away, if heat haze and things like that are really having an impact. But it does give you, it can be a little bit abstract, but that, much more moody kind of outcome. So just be aware of, and the other thing to be aware of is dust. So if you're in a dusty environment, that will obviously get onto your lens. So you need to make sure your lens is clean and keep it covered up. I tend to use the lens cap a lot in those situations, or failing that, I'll just keep that camera in a bag or keep a shirt over it or something like that, just to keep the dust off, so I'm not having to constantly clean the lens. Because once you're out there in the dust, if you're trying to clean it, if you're exposing the lens, it gets a bit tricky. You may not be too successful with that. So be aware of that. I also try and keep dust off the camera body itself, because I have had issues with dust getting between the camera lens and the camera body and giving me communication errors. So that's not a situation you really want to have to work with. And of course, if dust is getting in there, it's getting into where the sensor is and all that stuff too. So shooting in dust, you really, first of all, try and keep everything covered as much as possible, so that you absolutely minimize the amount of dust, particularly, well, that's getting on the camera, but particularly on the lens, because obviously that will create an effect. If you get enough, that will start to give you these sort of hazy looking things. With heat distortion, you're probably a long shot anyway. You're probably a fair way off if it's significant. I mean, if you're close and it's still really significant, then that's probably not an environment you want to be in for too long anyway, I would suggest. So just think about it. Can you get physically closer? Is that a possibility? If you try and zoom in, it won't. You've still got the same distance between you and the subject. You just magnified. You've optically gone in closer, but physically you've got the same issue. So I would simply look at, well, okay, be flexible. Think on your feet. What can I do in this situation that's going to give me an interesting result, an unusual photograph? Why not? So that was number 4, just underestimating atmospheric heat distortion and distance. And again, what I would suggest there is, again, try not to monkey, or to chimp rather, but do have a look at what you've got as much as you can. I mean, what you see on the back of the camera generally looks a lot better than what you've got if it's a bit marginal, but all you can do is see what you can see while you're there. I generally zoom in on the back a bit as well, but that is a little JPEG that's produced, and it's not the same as the final image. Okay, and then finally, number 5, poor stabilisation technique. So this comes down to a little bit what I mentioned before when you're in a vehicle, but if you're hand-holding, which you probably will be for a lot of it, You really need to practice bracing. You need to practice techniques. So keeping yourself steady, holding your breath, gently squeezing the shutter button, no sudden movements so that you jerk the camera, all that kind of stuff. If you're on a vehicle, so I mentioned earlier, if I'm on a stationary vehicle and I'm resting the lens on the side of the vehicle, something like a beanbag is really, really useful. Or if not, I'll use a rolled up jacket or something like that. Just something to damp out any vibration from the engine that's coming through the vehicle itself, because there will likely be some if you've got the engine running. You can do a faster shutter speed as well, so that might be a way of that will minimize the impact of that. The other thing that you can't do much about when I'm talking about vehicles is people moving about, because people always will. You're set up for the perfect shot, and then somebody moves and it all goes all over the place. So if you're not very practiced at hand holding and shooting, then I'd strongly recommend you do. Put yourself down to either a 60th of a second or use the inverse focal length rule. So in other words, if you are, or the inverse shutter speed, I should say, rule. So if you are, sorry, is the inverse focal length? It's been a long day. So if your focal length is 100 millimeters, that's the lens you're using, then don't shoot any slower than 1/100 millimeters, so 100th of a second. Or if it's a cropped sensor, generally the rule of thumb is to do twice the focal length. So in the case of the 100 millimeter focal length, try not to go lower than 1/200th of a second. If you are using a long telephoto, so I use a 100-400, I work with the longest focal length. So with that, I'll try not to shoot less than 1/400th of a second, because there's quite a lot of lens basically in front of my center of gravity. So you've got two issues there. One is it's heavier. The center of gravity is further away from the body of the camera, which makes it slightly more difficult to balance. And because you're magnifying more, any very small change in angle is going to be magnified, just as you're magnifying the subject. So just practice stabilisation technique. There's not really much else you can do with that. If you can use a monopod or a small tripod, that's great. But often with wildlife, you can't. So it is down to practice and technique, and maybe just do a bit of strength exercises so that you're a little bit, if you're stronger, you're steadier with the gear, depending on how heavy it is. Okay, so as I said, that was number 5. So in this podcast, I'll just recap. So the first mistake, or the first issue, is the shutter speed being too slow for the subject. So that comes down to what kind of result you want to get, really. But if in doubt, shoot fast. Just shoot fast, and that's likely to freeze things. The wrong autofocus mode or the wrong autofocus point for moving subjects. So again, if you're using an AI system on your camera, then just practice with it. If you have a pet or something, see if you can get it running about whether there are things in the way, and see how well it tracks, so that you know what you can expect. But it is really important to know your gear. And if you're working with older gear or DSLR, then I recommend using the smallest autofocus point, generally the one in the center, just to keep it simple, and use back button focus. So you set the focus once, and then you can recompose and track the animal, and you haven't got to worry about when you're pressing the shutter button, the camera just locks onto the wrong thing. Number 3, we were talking about shooting wide open when you shouldn't. So again, it's just understanding a little bit more about how depth of field works, particularly with your gear and the lens you're using. So as I say, if you're using a telephoto lens and you're further away from your subject, both of which are likely with wildlife, then just be aware of exactly what depth of field you're working with. So you may have a depth of field preview button, depending on your camera, or have a look at what it shoots, do a test shot if you have time, and go with that. But if in doubt, just shoot with a physically smaller aperture. So rather than f2.8, go to f5.6 or f8, If in doubt, maybe start at f8 would be my recommendation, because you're sort of in the middle of the range. And again, depending on the scenario, you might get some out of focus background anyway, but you can, you should have your target animal nicely in focus if that's what you're going for. Okay, number 4, I spoke about underestimating what happens with atmospherics, heat distortion, and distance. So look, I think this probably not one you're likely to come across that often, if only because it tends to happen middle of the day in very hot places. And the reason I'm saying you're probably not going to come across it that much is that even if you are in those environments, first of all, they're really unpleasant to be in yourself. You need to be drinking lots of water, as much shade as you can. But also, the animals aren't going to be doing much either. It's too hot for them. Most of them will be finding a shady spot and having some sleep. So, and generally as well, in that scenario, you've got middle of the daylight, which is very, very harsh. It burns out details. You're not... Look, you might get something. You could get, as I say, you could get something a little bit atmospheric, a little bit different. So from that perspective, it's worth having a go. But if you want to get the more, let's say, the more regular, the more predictable wildlife kind of pictures, that's not the ideal time of day to be doing it. And then finally, number 5, poor stabilisation technique in the field. So that comes down to just working on your technique, how to hold the camera. So I always recommend elbows into your sides so that you're nice and strong, you're nice and steady. If you can, lean against something. And that breathing technique is also really important. So you take a deep breath, you hold it while you're pressing the shutter. So your body isn't moving through breathing. And when you press the shutter button, just gently press it down and hold it until you hear the whole thing, the whole cycle click. So that your mirror's back up, or the photograph's been taken. And then think about what you can use to brace the camera. So it might be a beanbag. I braced on all sorts of things. So it's just about looking at what's around and doing that. Okay, so that is it for this one. Now, what I'm going to look at next week is we're going to look at composition mistakes, because they're really common. I talk a fair bit about composition anyway. I have a composition course that I run periodically, and of course in my online course, so discovering DSLR mirrorless photography, a lot of that is a big chunk of it is, I think there's actually 2 sections in there are about composition and composition technique, because once you've got a good composition technique, or you've got some ideas or some just guides that you can fall back on, that can immediately make a big difference to your photographs and how they feel, how engaging they are. So anyway, we'll talk more about that next time. So thank you for listening. Please like, subscribe, all those other things. I think you can hype. I haven't worked out how to hype, but I see it on other people's YouTube videos, so I'll throw it in. And if you've got anything you would like me to talk about in the podcast as well, I always like to hear those, or any feedback. It's always good to know. All right. Thanks very much. Have a great week. I'll be back on Friday and speak to you then. Bye for now. Thank you for listening. Now, just before I go, surprisingly, I'm going to ask if you could like and subscribe, because a lot of people don't, and it really makes a difference. So please do that if you can. Now, I have a few things going on. There are free webinars every month at the moment, short courses running. So please take a look at the website, www.ge.photography, and you'll see what's happening. As I say, there are a few things going on, and hopefully something that will float your boat. So thanks for listening to the podcast. Have a great day. I'll speak to you next time. Bye for now.